Balkan Threads is a podcast powered by Bunker that invites listeners to see the Balkans beyond political borders and stereotypes. I am your host, Lazar Tripinovic, and in each episode, I talk with guests from across the region to share their personal stories. Together, we will explore the Balkans as a shared flow of traditions, experiences, and ideas. We will open today's episode with a quote from The Culture of Lies, a collection of political essays from Dubravka Ugrešić, a writer and essayist from Croatia. Petar Petrović stands on a frontier between before and after, between one time and another, between one reality and another, between past and future, and trembles, and he clearly feels that those who stand in confusion like he does seemingly disappear, and those who make a decision hold in their hand a ticket for the future, a ticket for Balkan Express. Dear listeners, thank you for joining us in our fourth episode. My guest for today is Aljoša Lovrić from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Before starting this episode, I was thinking who would be the best guest from this beautiful country. And I was thinking, should I be chasing somebody who comes from a community that is less represented within the country? But then I realized that, as in many ways, the heart of our peninsula, I should actually find a guest who draws his origin from multiple peoples of this country. And as always, we will start this episode by exploring the local identity of our guest.
The task of representing a country as diverse as Bosnia is very difficult. Well, I'll try to do my best in this podcast to show it in the best of light. I come from Zenica. It's the fourth biggest city in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is famously the seat of the biggest prison in all of former Yugoslavia. It's very famous for its steel mill and coal mining. The city basically didn't exist before 1945. You had the steel mill that was built by the Austro-Hungarians, and only after 1945, after World War II, after socialism in Yugoslavia, did Zenica really begin to expand. And as a look, you have this true Yugoslavian socialist city where socialist skyscrapers dominate, and there's a lot of industry around the city, but
There's still most of the people in the city work in the steel industry.
It's fallen very far from its peak. At its peak, it employed about 30,000 people. Now it's like less than 2,000.
I remember when I was in Tuzla, there are very particular churches and mosques that were built by Zlatko Ugrin, who was a famous architect who built actually socialist style religious buildings. Does that exist in Zenica as well?
I wouldn't say so. Zenica during communism was a seat of communist support. It was removed from religion, so you don't have as many religious objects.
I like Bosnia is best represented in Sarajevo. You really see portions of history coming together, a completely Ottoman part of the city, a completely Austrian part of the city, and then a completely socialist part of the city. Let's start by you telling us a little bit more about your intimate heritage.
I think you got a good guess here, because I'm a good mix of all the different sides in Bosnia. So my name is Aljoša. My mother is a Bosnian Serb, also from Zenica. Dad is a Bosnian Croat from a village in Croat central Bosnia. And I was born in Zenica, which is a majority Bosniak city. So I have all three of the constitutive peoples in me or with me. It's one of the many beautiful things about Bosnia. I feel like, as you mentioned, the architecture, for example, and the identities in Bosnia, it all shows a changing history. And identities in Bosnia have also changed over time, with architectural periods, with new empires coming, with new states taken over or falling apart. And it's created a really complex story, and there's many complex stories, such as mine, where you have mixed identities and you never clearly belong to one side in a country where you're often forced to pick what your side is.
How is, in that sense, the identity, generally speaking, of Bosnia and Herzegovina changed over time?
So I can tell you the stories I know from my grandma and my mom and stuff. So this would be in the 60s onward. My dad grew up in a village, in a very rural area, purely Croatian ethnic community. So he hasn't really been exposed to any other different perspectives growing up. For my dad's side of the family, I'd say it's a little unusual if you're different, but still welcoming. I don't feel like there was ever any hostility towards other groups in Bosnia. And I had like family members from my dad's side like fight in the war. I think my granddad and I fought against Bosniaks, and they had nothing against Bosniaks. Like nowadays, they visit us in Zenica and they have no problems. So before and after, nothing really changed in their perspective on how they view other people. And for my mom's side, well, my grandma was devout communist during like the 70s and 80s. I think she even identified as Yugoslavian rather than Serbian. So to them, these divisions that were created and existed after the 90s where they were just not present before. Countries come and go. I feel like my family has had to adapt to the general narrative, even though within themselves they've never really cared who you are and what your name is and what your background is.
I have to mention this just because it's so common that Bosnia gets discussed only through the DL conflict. But it's so weird. If I think like what's the most hospitable country in the Balkans, it really goes to Bosnia. How do you feel those two things interact? Do you feel like in a way that it's just a contradiction or paradox, or is it actually a certain wisdom?
I think that's a good way of looking at the history of Bosnia and the region in general. Again, as I mentioned a few sentences ago, you were forced to pick a side, even though you didn't really want to. Most people in the region and in the country have no ill intentions towards anybody, even if you may dislike another group. Personal dislikes end at I'm just gonna stay away, I'm just choose not to interact, and that's not a good solution, but it's not inherently hostile. Yeah, because people in Bosnia are aware that times like these come and go. During times when you can afford to give somebody really good hospitality, you're gonna find that in Bosnia. And I also feel like between our two bigger and more famous neighbors in Croatia and Serbia, Bosnia somehow always ends up last. You know, it doesn't have a sea, or like if you want to go skiing, the mountains are better in Serbia, or there's more views in Croatia. So whenever we get tourists, you just want to represent your country the best possible way, and everybody wants to do that. A lot of people from Bosnia and Herzegovina have a feeling that this is an underappreciated, a bit of a hidden gem. Let me help you discover how nice this place is. That's why in times of good, people are so good towards each other. But because history has forced the bad times over and over again, unfortunately, people have just grown accepting towards like changes in relations between peoples or what you have to do. And it's a good thing and a bad thing.
I try to go like every year for Sarajevo Film Festival. I'm not gonna exaggerate when I say it's really like a magical week, because I can really feel like the whole city is like, this is our week. Everybody is up on their feet trying to give like the best impression. It's really the place to be every summer. You mentioned how you pick an identity. How would you say that works oftentimes?
Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country in which labels matter a lot. It's important for you as an individual to try figure out which labels suit you best. People with backgrounds who don't give them clear labels, if you're from a mixed marriage, from any of the communities, I feel like you're never cleanly going to fit into any of these labels. And there's also some sort of inherent feeling of rejection of these labels. So you oppose a society that is built on the labels. As you said, Bosnia is a melting pot of traditions, religions, history. Even the people with quote unquote clear backgrounds, clear labels, often ignore that their ancestors 300 or 400 years ago would have had a different religion or like would have identified differently. You mentioned how countries change, identities change as well. We know in Bosnia, before the Ottomans came, you had a branch of Catholicism called the Church of Bosnia, and they were declared as pagans. However, this was like a Christian identity, and then a good part of these Christians ended up converting to Islam because they found Islam to be closer to their beliefs. So again, people who today identify as Muslim would have been 400, 500 years ago, would have been identifying as Christians, even though that meant a different thing than Christianity as we imagine it today in Bosnia. About trying to navigate the complex landscape and trying to figure out what label is yours while also doing what you can to point out that identities outside of these labels exist and that these labels just inherently are dividing people into groups that don't include everybody. And it's just going to create unnecessary friction in the country, and just trying to oppose that whenever it's possible.
I feel like most people are aware of how likely their heritage is diverse, but they tend to ignore it.
People choose to ignore or just don't know. Politicians, especially, I think, belong to this category, well, because you will have politicians who have built career on one set of ideals and then today are known for completely another one. Milorad Dodik, when he came on the stage, he was an pro-Western, pro-NATO supporter who was judgmental of like what happened, the Serbian leadership during the war in Bosnia. Today, he's obviously like stumbling blocks toward Bosnia functioning as a normal country. People choose that out of convenience. They can get further with that, or they can exploit the visuals they make. And at the end of the day, I really do believe that all three of the leaders of the groups in Bosnia, at the end of the day, they sit down at the table and they shake hands and they're happy with their spoils. And it's us who do the fighting for no reason. It's only for their own benefit.
And there's like a big cultural difference to geographic lines. Bosnia versus Herzegovina. Is that reflected in any way on like the Croatian identity within the country? Like Bosnia Croats versus Herzegovina Croats?
That's a good question. And I do think it does, although I haven't really given this much thought. So then I'm going to have to come up with an answer here. Herzegovinians are their own identity. There's a reputation that they're more relaxed. Croatians who live in Herzegovina, so I'm going to call them Herzegovinians, even though they're Bosniak Herzegovinians as well. I feel like they proudly identify as Herzegovinian. So you will see them introduce themselves not as Bosnian Croat or as Croat, but as Herzegovets. So I think the identity between Croatians living in Herzegovina is strongly connected to the regional identity, while Croats from like central Bosnia and maybe northern Bosnia, I feel like they would connect more closely with the general identity of being Croatian.
Regional identities are, I feel like a whole category of identity in the world that just kind of gets overlooked because we like to talk about like countries or nationalities, religions, so on. But really like these like regional identities feel like literally motivate outlook on the world, like that one region that for whatever reason people are so proud of. Talking about pride, I know you're a big fan of football. How did you feel now that Bosnia and Herzegovina has made a huge win?
Football is the most important, unimportant thing in the world. This is a very common quote. It's always used to describe football. But I feel like it's important to first understand how big the game really is. I was writing an email to my professor the other day because I missed my class because I was watching Bosnia beat Italy in a dramatic penalty shootout the other day. I was curious how many people watched the last World Cup, and the final was watched by almost 2 billion people, and the whole event was followed by 5 billion people in the world. Whoever you pick in the world randomly, they're more likely to watch football than not to watch football, at least for the biggest event. You have such a big driver of interest. Football can really be used for state building, for identity building, and I feel like Bosnia and Herzegovina is a very interesting case study of this because you have a country in which two of the three groups wouldn't, at first glance at least, wouldn't primarily identify with that country. Croats from Bosnia would primarily identify with Croatia and Serbs with Serbia. And now you have the challenge for one national team to capture the attention of a whole country, but the whole country doesn't identify with the national team. So how do you do it? First, the nature of the win. It's Bosnia playing against like a 4-time World Cup winner, 2-time European winner. Like Italy is one of the best teams in Europe, and you're playing in Zenica in this stadium that's falling apart. Your best player is like a 41-year-old, you know. So it's this battle of David versus Goliath. And when you, as such a big underdog, win, going to elicit more positive responses in general. And I feel like this Bosnian national team is more reflective of what Bosnia is as a country. More players have accepted to play for Bosnia as a national team.
Why did they choose to do that this time?
In this generation, you have a lot of players who you can only compete for one national team. So if you fail to reach a level where you can compete for Croatia, which plays in the World Cup final, or Serbia, which at least on paper is a better team.
On paper.
On paper, it'll be walking the World Cup TV. Well, I think it's natural players just are ambitious and want to aim higher, and these two teams are supposed to achieve better results than Bosnia. So Bosnia is, again, I'm talking about when you visit the Balkans, Bosnia is always kind of plan B or C. Here for football, it's also kind of plan B or C. If I don't make it to this country's team, then I'll play for Bosnia. This team had a couple of players that decided to play for Bosnia, and because you had a more ethnically diverse team, which people with diverse backgrounds find easier to connect to. When Bayraktarovic scored a goal to send us to America, there were crazy celebrations in both Bosnia and Croatian population centers. And I'm very happy to see that. I'm happy to see the national team be a driver of unity, because I don't think we benefit, us the people benefit from any divisions. I just think it's playing into the hands of a couple of people. To see a vessel that I love so much, football, play such a positive role in my country, I'm very proud of that.
That was like a beautiful moment to see like sports doing what it is supposed to do. What are the main football things and how do people go about that?
So first of all, just to clarify, Hajduk is the club I'd say chosen, but a kind of, I think more accurate, curse to support. Within Bosnia itself, you have Sarajevo and Željezničar. Those kind of represent background of the people of Sarajevo rather than being connected to nationality. In Mostar, it's connected to nationality. We'll get there. So Sarajevo and Željezničar fight between more of a club formed by the people, by workers, and clubs formed by like elites. In Mostar, there's the division between Velej and Zrinjski. Zrinjski has an especially controversial history. It was banned during Yugoslavia because it was deemed too Croatian nationalist. During the war, essentially what happened is that Zrinjski stole Velej Stadium in Mostar. So there's a lot of really tough baggage associated with that football derby. I lived in Mostar for 2 years, and whenever there was a Velej Zrinjski game, the school would shut down. The rivalry there is entirely based off of ethnic divisions. It's Velej is the Bosniak club, Zrinjski is the Croat one, and that's it. For any game, you're gonna have like fights before and after, and there's gonna be like questionable chanting and stuff like that. So I think that's one of the derbies, because it's based on ethnic division, that brings out maybe the worst sides of football in the Balkans.
Would you say like aside from football, there are like other sports that are better examples?
So Zenica is mainly Bosniak, and the only really big club from the city is called Čelik Zenica. But football is again a bit associated with nationalism because it's used as a vehicle for state building. But I feel like basketball is a bit more removed. So my friends from Zenica who are not Bosniaks are less likely to be Čelik football supporters, but would be more open towards going to the Čelik basketball game, because is the only team that represents Bosnia, that represents Zenica in basketball.
We have a little bit more time left. Is there anything that you would particularly like to share?
I think it would also be interesting to share the story of how football helped me figure out who and what I am. First football game I've been to was the 100th anniversary of the formation of Hajduk. It was played in the summer, and Barcelona came to Split and played against Hajduk. And me, that was 2011, so I was 8 years old. So me as an 8-year-old, obviously I was an avid Barcelona fan. Like, what is Hajduk even? Never heard of that. I want to go see Barcelona. So my dad ended up with tickets through like pure luck. And we went to a game, and every time Barcelona had a chance, I was like, how did I miss that? It ended 0-0. And when we were at the stadium, my dad was telling me, can't do that. We were like surrounded by Hajduk fans. That was my first game, and Hajduk was my introduction to football. And over time, I just grew to love the sport. I was always a Barcelona fan because you need to choose a good team that wins things, right? And Hajduk is not one of those teams. I feel like you should support something local, and I support Hajduk because my dad lives and works in Split for the last 25 years. So growing up, I've spent my whole summers until I was 10. I would spend like 3 months a year minimum in Split, just on the seaside. My mom was studying, which she was in college, so she wasn't really working back then. So I spent a lot of time in Split growing up, and then later on just constantly come back to the city. When I graduate, I'm going to go to Split and I'm going to start building my career there. Hajduk was an introduction to football. Football fell very closely to my heart, and Hajduk was representing Split wherever it's played and whoever it played against. So because it kind of represented a city I was very proud of, I chose Hajduk as a team to support, and because of that, I feel like I just kind of tilted a bit more towards the Croatian side of my identity. I'm sure if I chose Partizan, I would tilt it otherwise.
You see, I really like this story because football has a folkloric function in our societies. And it's actually really similar because like it served you a positive aspect of sport, local identity, team spirit, challenging like an international champion are all of really positive functioning of sport that persists despite a certain politicization of, for example, football in our countries. And I think it's actually really wonderful that you build your identity around those positive aspects. And that's a really healthy way. because a lot of people just choose identity. Oh, I was just born somewhere, or they fall under an influence of something. But this is actually really cool. Aljoša, as somebody who studies international affairs, I had like one question that I think I've been like pondering upon for a long time, because we already mentioned, right, like Bosnia and Herzegovina has lived through like many divisions, right, like literally since the Romans. But also all of these conflicts, people usually would, there's definitely social change, but people would still continue living together. But today we're for the first time really, like when I say today, I mean after a conflict in the 90s and Bosnia's independence, we're for the first time seeing actually some sort of segregation within the country, right? Like different school systems or borders, of which some are pretending to be almost country borders. What would you attribute that to?
It's an interesting question, but as you mentioned, Bosnia was the border between Western and Eastern Roman Empire. It was always this clash. It was a place where bigger players than Bosnia clashed against each other, and for most of modern history, I'd say that would be it was a game between a Russian interest, an Ottoman interest, and an Austrian, Austro-Hungarian interest. And I feel like us, the people, Croats, the Bosniaks, and the Serbs, and that excludes other Balkan identities, we've always had to fight off a much, much bigger, larger, and stronger oppressor. And the only way you could do that is unite. And that's what happened in revolts and revolutions during, especially during Ottoman occupations of Serbia and Bosnia. Serbian fighters would be supported by Bosnian populations. Some would fight, some would give resources, place to sleep at, refuge from Turkish patrols, whatnot. So I think the only change is the lack of a larger player being involved in the last conflict. In World War II, it was still the partisans were fighting against the Germans and the Italians, like the superpowers of fascist Europe. This time it was just us fighting against us. This lack of a common enemy allowed people who saw spaces where they could personally benefit from division create these divisions. And the divisions turned out to be so violent. Actually, I'm writing my thesis currently on Bosnia and Herzegovina, and one of the main resources I'm using is a book by Richard Holbrooke, and he was the main U.S. negotiator for the Dayton Peace Agreement, which ended the wars in Bosnia and Croatia. So he personally negotiated with Izetbegovic, Milosevic, and Tudjman. And there's this conversation where he's sitting with Milosevic and Izetbegovic. It's just them saying this got way out of our hands. The leaders created divisions to benefit from them, but the divisions during the war were so violent and so radical. And I don't know why. I don't know why people form like voluntary groups to go and commit the like things that were committed, or why leaders chose to support the decisions that were made during war. I think that's how you ended up with still a divided society today.
But I think that's constitution is really important to keep in mind. That is really the reason why I feel like these borders are painful. But then with Bosnia, any sort of border actually cuts between the heritage that we share, regardless of who you identify with. Like it cuts between the very fresh memories. I was today talking actually about this football match with my mom, and then she was like, I still remember when I as a kid went to Sarajevo for the Winter Olympics. Those are fresh memories of love between different people. And when you have now an actual border that kind of cuts through, that's a form of a wound. I think that's something that is important to keep in mind. The fact that we still talk about this and we'll have to talk about it more is because there's a need to cross any sort of a border, right? Like when I go to Sarajevo, what hurts about it is the fact that people with whom I share my passport hurt the city. It doesn't hurt just, I would be ashamed if they went anywhere else. If I found out that they were deployed to the other side of the planet, I would be ashamed of that. But it actually hurts since this is a city that by every means I feel I could belong to.
That was really well spoken. And I think that when you look at what's real and what's not, and you look at borders and identities and stuff, when you look throughout history, you're going to see this entity called like the Kingdom of Bosnia. And it existed in like 1300s, and it just for hundreds of years had its own flag, kings, and whatnot. Bosnia is, we think, a concept for a very long time, and it disappeared from a map for a very long time, but so that many other countries, Poland wasn't on a map for 1,000 years, yet the Poles were always a large people. So this happens to countries. They disappear from a map. Just because they're gone from a map doesn't mean that they're not there. I feel like Bosnia today, the borders are roughly based on these historical borders. They're based on what has actually happened. But when you look at the administrative borders within Bosnia, when you look at the inter-entity line between the Federation and the Republika Srpska, this is a completely arbitrary line. It's like, when you look at it, the shape feels irregular. There's even enclaves and stuff because of political agreements. Within the Federation, have the 10 canta. The borders between them are not based on anything. They're not based on history or mountains or rivers or just administrative divides. And what I'm trying to say is that Bosnia is real. This identity is real. And Bosnia is a country of Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs, and others. But Bosnia cannot exist without these three peoples. But the divisions caused by the war and the divisions that exist in modern Bosnia today are arbitrary. You look at them at a map, they don't follow logic. And because it's so easy to identify that these divisions are not something that belongs there, we should have an easier time to move past them. I think these barriers were constructed in a very short amount of time. Between Tito died and the war starting, there's 11 years. So let's say for a few years, you still had the spirit of Tito, brotherhood and unity. So within like 8 or 9 years, enough divisions were created to build foundation to divide us for the next. But now 30 years, will this Bosnia exist for another 30, 50, or 100? How can these artificial foundations built within such a short period of time be so persistent in a country which has operated for thousands of years with different people without these divisions? I feel like the sooner we, the people of Bosnia, and all three of the peoples and other identities that find themselves in Bosnia, we need to wake up. We need to snap out of this. We need to realize that this is not giving us any benefit. The system needs to be torn down. A new status quo needs to be built that represents what Bosnia really is.
I think that message that's bigger than Bosnia. At the end of the day, any system that upholds divisions and that relies on animosity does need to be torn out, because a country and these people exist by unity. And I know it's not a very historic term, but I'll stick with love, because at the end of the day, people like where they're from, regardless of how many identities they have. I would invite anyone and everyone to learn about all the histories that belong to you, because hardly you fall only within one basket. There's always a little bit more to learn. And if you learn a little bit more about different identities, again, that you can relate to in histories that belong to you, it'll help you also connect with others. Thank you, Aljoša, a lot for today. I think this was really fresh perspective and a really important one, because as I said at the beginning, right, I feel like Bosnia and Herzegovina is really like the heart of the Balkans. It is the country where many divisions went through, but exactly because of that, it is a country that is a melting pot of all of the traditions that our whole peninsula inherited.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really am supportive of what you're trying to investigate with these episodes. And thank you so much for the opportunity to display my unique identity.